Hi Year 12, so this is the first session on the historical notes of the Handmaid's Tale, and it's probably worth making a few notes before we continue here, just about the purpose and the structure of the historical notes and why they are essential to our understanding of the narrative. So it's interesting that number of readers ignore the historical notes, and often you'll find that when people get to the end of the Handmaid's Tale, they see the historical notes more as a kind of author's notes or an author's appendices, and they don't realise that they are integral to the text, integral to Margaret Atwood's purpose within the text, and essential for us as students of this text in terms of understanding the role of Gilead and the many purposes that Atwood has in terms of looking at society and looking at our own reactions to what happens. So the historical notes have a variety of purposes. They to a certain extent, as we read them, you will begin to see this. They add credibility to Offred's narrative. Her narrative is the study, the subject of academic study in the future. And so we have this sense that her narrative lives beyond the end of her own story, and that gives credence and credibility to her, but it also gives purpose to her character. They are themselves a warning about how we go about learning from history or not learning from history, and how we go about exploring what happens in the world around us through the lens of study, whether that's scientific study, anthropology, academics, historical, however you look at it. They also have, the historical notes have a variety of functions. It's a really important way for Atwood to deal with a great amount of information about Gilead that Offred is just not in a position to give us. Her story is limited to the role of a handmaid within the regime. And so there is an enormous amount of information and goings on and activities that she would just never be able to share with the reader, because she is unable to experience, and she's not in a position to know that. And so we have that information shared with us through the lens of academic study. It's also makes very clear for us that Gilead itself ended, that it has become history. And that in a way is a message of hope for the reader, that the human tragedy, the personal tragedy of this moment in history is over. And it's interesting as we go through the historical notes, and it's another reason why it's so important to study them, to see that although Gilead itself is over, many of the attitudes, many of the ways of thinking and the ideologies that Gilead rose out of are still in existence. So this is really important. It's really important for us to get stuck into. It's so important. I've got loads of extra notes that I just couldn't fit around my copy of the text. So we'll go through these as we go. I suspect this is going to be 3 videos to look at this. So let's have a look at how the historical notes are set up. Firstly, you'll notice that this is a change of register for Atwood here. She goes from an individual female voice to mainly the majority of the historical notes is written by a male academic. So we have a sense of change of formality as well. So, being a partial transcript of the proceedings of the 12th Symposium on Gileadian Studies, held as part of the International Historical Association Convention, which took place in the University of Denay, Nunavut, on June the 25th, 2195. So we have this leap of about 200 years into the future, which is very important for us to understand. So this isn't a close look at Gilead from people who have personal interest or personal connections to Gilead, even if you were to compare it to our historical understanding in the early, the 2000s of what happened in Nazi Germany. There are still, first-hand sources available for that, individual testimony, personal stories by those that are still living. When we jump 200 years into the future, there is a sense of true disconnection between the individuals and the time period being studied and those that are looking at it. So it would be much more like us today thinking about, not even about the Victorian era because we have such a wealth of evidence, but maybe something like the individual life of a person during the Tudor period. And then the other thing here to draw out is this partial transcript. And of course the word partial has two meanings. So it means a part or a fragment of something. But also if you think about the antonym of partial, which is impartial, to be partial to something is to have a sense of bias. And Atwood is so clever as a wordsmith, and she's hinting up front here that despite this being an academic symposium by the Centre for Gileadian Studies, we have this idea that this isn't a purely clinical or scientific exploration of the topic. And then we have the University of Dene, Nunavut. And again, Margaret Atwood is playing on words here. So Dene, she's she's changed the spelling of one of the dominant people groups in Canada, which is the Dene, spelled D-E-N-E. And so we have this reframing of this kind of, it's similar to Inuit, this reframing of this word from Dene to deny, Nunavut. And so if you blend them together, we have deny Nunavut. And this sense here that Atwood is challenging the reader and the listener to deny none of Offred's story, to deny none of what she's told us. It's also worth noting here that Dene is one of the coldest, most sparsely populated regions of Canada. And as we know, Margaret Atwood is a Canadian writer. She wrote some of The Handmaid's Tale partially while she was in Berlin, partially while she was in England, partially while she was in Canada. And Canada, in terms of this setting here, is definitely not blame free. And we'll look at it as we get into the historical notes, but the kind of extreme liberalism that Canada is well known for has, as far as Atwood appears to suggest here, has failed in stopping Gilead, and that kind of tolerance and appeasement of the countries around Gilead, rather than the kind of the standing, making an ethical or a moral stand. And so we have that that is part of this. And then we have the chair of this symposium, Professor Marianne Crescent Moon, Department of Caucasian Anthropology at the University of Dene, Nunavut. And so just some interesting things to note here, particularly the inversion of what seems to be the dominant ethnicity. We don't generally have departments of Caucasian anthropology because the white person is the dominant ethnicity. And so we might have the idea of African American studies, And you'll know that in this country we have entire universities dedicated to Orientalism and Asian studies. And so we have this idea that in order to create then a department of Caucasian studies, we may have seen an inversion in the dominant norm of the white person being the majority ethnicity, because this appears to be part of the minority. And then Marianne Crescent Moon. So Crescent Moon, traditionally this would be a kind of Amerindian name, potentially Inuit, and then we have her given the European sounding Marianne as her first name. Keynote speaker, Professor James Darcy Pieixoto, Director, 20th and 21st Century Archives, Cambridge University, England. And we have the oldest university in the world reference there. And then, of course, we have this kind of comparison of the reference there to Harvard University being used as the heart of Gilead, and the heart of the kind of the propaganda and the message and the deception of Gilead. And here we just have an interesting narrative about the continuation of the knowledge and research and potentially some of the messages that come out of that. Okay, so let's start with Crescent Moon's opening remarks. I'm delighted to welcome you here this morning, and I'm pleased to see that so many of you turned out for Professor Pieixoto's, I am sure, fascinating and worthwhile talk. We of the Gileadian Research Association believe that this period well repays further study, responsible as it ultimately was for the redrawing of the map of the world, especially in this hemisphere. And so we have that first kind of piece of information that we are able to give that Offred can't give us, that not only in terms of national borders, but also in terms of geopolitical borders, the map of the world has been redrawn as a result of the Gilead regime. Before we proceed, a few announcements. The fishing expedition will go forward tomorrow as planned. And so here we have another piece of information that apparently the environment has recovered following the environmental disasters that we saw as being one of the causes that gave rise to Gilead. And so again, we have this period of 200 years showing that there have been great shifts and changes. And for those of you who have not brought suitable rain gear and insect repellent, these are available at the normal charge at the registration desk. The Nature Walk and Outdoor Period Costume Sing-Song have been rescheduled for the day after tomorrow, as we are assured by our own infallible Professor Johnny Running Dog of a break in the weather at the time. And so here, again, just the thing to draw out. So the Outdoor Historical Costume Sing-Song, and this is a symposium that's dedicated to Gilead. So they are dressing up in costumes from Gilead and singing songs. And we again have that reminder, all of us will have probably at some point participated when we were at primary school in those kind of, dress like an Egyptian, spend the day as a Victorian, all of those things. And this idea that history and real lives and real stories are often reduced and filtered through the sieve of time into a form of things that are entertaining, that are gripping, that are that kind of to a certain extent belittle the reality of individual life. Let me remind you of the other events sponsored by the Gileadian Research Association that are available to you at the convention. As part of the 12th symposium, tomorrow afternoon, Professor Gopal Chatterjee of the Department of Western Philosophy, University of Baroda, India, will speak on Krishna and Kali elements in state religion of the early Gilead period. And I think as we look at this section, which is this kind of summary of all of the different things that are going on, and some history about Pieixoto particularly, it's worth mentioning this idea of filtering history through academic study. So the elements of Krishna and Kali in state religion of the early Gilead periods. Now we know that Offred is part of the early Gilead periods, and I wonder if any of you can tell me what elements of Krishna and Kali were evident from her narrative. And the chances are that you probably can't. And it's interesting then, really, that one of the dangers of looking at reality and the past through the lens of academic study and individual academics' interest is that it isn't unusual for an academic to pick a minute detail of study and then to focus on that one detail, potentially and at the loss of many other important details, and to create great meaning from that. And so we have this particular professor who's picked this minute detail from Gilead and is creating meaning from that. Then we have, there is this morning presentation. There is a morning presentation on Thursday by Professor Sieglinde van Buren from the Department of Military History at the University of San Antonio, Republic, love that, of Texas. Professor Van Buren will give what I am sure will be a fascinating illustrated lecture on the Warsaw tactic, policies of urban core encirclement in the Gileadian civil wars. And again, we have this direct comparison of we've seen so many times throughout the novel between Gilead and what happened in Nazi Germany. And this time then, this is the Nazi creation of this kind of urban ghetto in Warsaw, to isolate the Jews and to for a variety of purposes. And so it's a direct comparison between that and what's happened in Gilead. So I'm sure all of us will wish to attend these. I must also remind you that our keynote speaker, although I'm sure it is not necessary, to keep within his time period, as I wish to leave space for questions. I expect none of us wants to miss lunch, as happened yesterday, and we have laughter, and then we have this introduction to Professor Pieixoto. So Professor Pieixoto scarcely needs any introduction, as he is well known to all of us, if not personally, then through his extensive publications. These include Sumptuary Laws Through the Ages, an analysis of documents, and sumptuary laws are the civil laws about what clothing may or may not be worn. Now, for those of us that are living in a contemporary period, we don't have a great deal of those, although we do know countries where that is present. But if we were to look through and back into British history, then we would realise that there were certain periods of time where there were sumptuary laws, and those were defined around your status in society. There would have been certain colours, certain fabrics, certain styles of clothing that you were or were not allowed to wear depending on your social status. And well-known study, and this is his second thing that he's written, Iran and Gilead, two late 20th centuries monotheocracies as seen through diaries. And again, just as we have the direct comparison with Nazi Germany, Atwood here is creating further parallels through the historical notes between the Iranian regime under Ayatollah Khomeini in the late 60s all the way through until the late 80s, and Gilead. As you know, he is the co-editor, along with Professor Notley Wade, also of Cambridge, of the manuscript under consideration today, and was instrumental in its transcription, annotation and publication. The title of his talk is Problems of Authentication, in reference to the Handmaid's Tale. And then she hands over Professor Pieixoto, and we have the applause. And so we have a number of things here that are hinting at what is about to come, and is already setting us as the reader on edge. So we have he's been instrumental in the transcription, annotation and publication of The Handmaid's Tale, and the title of his talk is Problems of Authentication, and that begins to create unease for us because Offred's story is very fresh for us. We believe her entirely. We're invested in her narrative. And so then to begin to challenge it is something that the reader finds quite uncomfortable. So Pieixoto begins, and we'll unpick the first part of his talk and then look at the next section in the next video. So thank you. I'm sure we all enjoyed our charming Arctic char last night at dinner. An Arctic char is a fish, and he uses it now for a kind of little joke. And now we are enjoying an equally charming Arctic chair, which of course is Professor Crescent Moon. I use the word enjoy in two distinct senses, precluding, of course, the obsolete third. And we have immediately a sense of casual sexism that's being used. So we enjoyed our fish at dinner, that whole idea of being satisfied as you eat. I enjoyed the meal. Now we're enjoying the charming Arctic chair, Professor Crescent Moon, and we have charming Arctic char, charming Arctic chair, and he has this kind of, again, this belittling of this female academic. And then he talks about the third obsolete use of the word enjoy, which of course is to enjoy something sexually, and the audience laugh, and we have this sense of his pomposity, his facetious kind of self-involved narrative, but it also hints to casual sexism, misogyny, the sexualization of women, and this very much appears to still be a hallmark of humanity and society in this period 200 years into the future. We are not endeared to the professor, and Atwood very carefully crafts and constructs his speech so that we are forced to stand in opposition to him and his ideas, and we'll see why that is. So then he says, let me be serious. I wish, as the title of my little chat implies, to consider some of the problems associated with the Soi Descent manuscript, which means so-called, which is well known to all of you by now, which goes by the title of The Handmaid's Tale. So if his kind of sexual jokes about women weren't enough, the title of my little chat here, where he appears to be self-depreciating in a kind of false humility way, also reminds us of the commander. These are almost replicating his tone and his views about women and femininity. And then we have this belittling of the text itself, the so-called Handmaid Tales. I say soi disant because what we have before us is not the item in its original form, strictly speaking. It's not a manuscript at all when it was first discovered, and bore no title. The superscription The Handmaid's Tale was appended to it by Professor Wade, partly in homage to the great Geoffrey Chaucer, but for those of you who know Professor Wade informally as I do, will understand when I say that I'm sure all puns were intentional, particularly that having to do with the archaic vulgar signification of the word tale, that being to some extent the bone, as it were, of contention in that phase of Gileadian society of which our saga treats, and we have applause and laughter as he makes this sexual joke. So let's talk, and as we go through this, I want you to consider the difference between the idea of history, which for much of human society has told the story of men and patriarchy, because it's been involved with power structures, and her story, and the idea of value and worth being given to the stories of females within the historical period. So this narrative, this story of Offred, which has been given the title The Handmaid's Tale by Professor Wade, frames it then as being in reference to something masculine, male literary history. And so it's as if Professor Wade is saying this text has no right to stand by itself. It is not something in its own right. It's only in reference to something by the great Geoffrey Chaucer. And so we have again a reduction of the value of the Handmaid's Tale. And then we have the tale itself being as he calls it, vulgar, but he does it humorously, and so of course it's not vulgar, he just finds it funny, reference to the kind of the female buttocks and the sexualization of that part of the body. And so we have this sexualization and this joking reference to this kind of sexual woman talked about as part of academic study. And again, that sense that her story, Offred's story, is not seen as something that happened to a real person with that required an element of respect, an element of value. This item, and he refers to it as an item, occasionally he calls about it a document, often he calls it an item, and it's now discussed in reference to where it was found, along with the lock it was found with, and the tape, the cassette tapes, and all of those things are treated with equal value. Each artifact is dealt with the same kind of historical, almost archaeological interest and curiosity. And again, this then devalues Offred's story, because, you know, she is it is becoming as interesting as the Elvis Presley songs that are involved, or the locker that it's found in. So this item, I hesitate to use the word document, was unearthed on the site of what was once called the city of Bangor, in what at the time, prior to the inception of the Gileadian regime, would have been the state of Maine. We know that the city was a prominent way station in what our author refers to as the Underground Female Road, and this of course is the road the name, the Underground Road, references the slaves that were taken from the southern states of America up to the liberal north of America. And we know that the resistance in Gilead reframe that and call it the Underground Female Road, as they move the handmaids from one station to another along the road. And we see part of that history when Moira tells her story. Okay, but so he says the city was a prominent way station for what our author refers to as the Underground Female Road, since dubbed by some of our historical wags the Underground Frail Road. And again, we have this demeaning mockery as he makes the kind of joking, light-hearted, entertaining comment from for something that we know has this kind of devastating personal tragedy linked to it. So there are laughter and groans. For this, our association has taken particular interest in it. And I think at this point it's worth recognising that from the standpoint of history, 200 years in the future, these comments, these little jokes, may seem entirely harmless. But for us as readers, we haven't made that jump into the history. We don't have a sense of space or distance from Offred's story. We aren't disconnected from it yet. And Atwood is again using this and our reaction to Pieixoto's choice of words and his kind of jokes that he makes, and the demeaning terms by which he talks about women and Offred, and particularly elements of her narrative as we get through to it, is to Atwood is highlighting the damage and the danger of such a clinical detachment from an individual reality. The item in its pristine state consisted of metal footlocker, US Army issue circa perhaps 1955. The fact of itself need have no significance, as it is known that such footlockers were frequently sold as army surplus and must therefore have been widespread. Within this footlocker was sealed with tape, the kind once used on packages to be sent by post, was approximately 30 cassette tapes of the type that became obsolete sometime in the 80s or 90s in the advent of the compact disc. So these are those old-fashioned tapes that you may have seen. I remind you that this is not the first such discovery. You will doubtless familiar, for instance, with the item known as the AB Memoirs, located in a garage in the suburb of Seattle, and the Diary of P, excavated by accident during the erection of a new meeting house in the vicinity that was once Syracuse, New York. And again, we have this kind of slight drawing of a parallel between Offred's story and the Diary of Anne Frank from Nazi Germany, that this isn't, these narratives aren't isolated. Professor Wade and I were very excited by this new discovery. Luckily, we had several years before, with the aid of an excellent resident antiquarian technician, reconstructed a machine capable of playing such tapes. We immediately set about the painstaking work of transcription. And again, we have this idea that he's focusing on the process of this. He's focusing on all the different elements of the kind of historical artifacts that were discovered and placing equal value on them. And this is an artifact to him, it's not a story. There were some 30 tapes in the collection altogether, in varying proportions of music to spoken word. In general, each tape begins with 2 or 3 songs as camouflage, no doubt. Then the music is broken off and the speaking voice takes over. The voice is a woman's, and according to our voice print experts, the same one throughout. And so we have, again, this really interesting idea, and we'll talk more about this as we go through his kind of discussion of the process of writing The Handmaid's Tale up, that Offred's narrative isn't written at all, that it's actually spoken and recorded onto these 30 cassette tapes. And again, almost like voice diaries, we have this as a hallmark of female literature, female writing, écriture féminine, and that sense that there is something within the spoken words that is eminently female by comparison to the written word that is masculine. The labels on the cassettes were authentic period labels, dating, of course, from some time before the inception of the early Gilead era, as such secular music was banned under the regime. There were, for instance, 4 tapes entitled Elvis Presley's Golden Years, 3 of Folk Songs of Lithuania, 3 of Boy George Takes It Off, and 2 of Mantovani's Mellow Strings, as well as some titles which sported a mere single tape each. Twisted Sister at Carnegie Hall is one which I am particularly fond. And so again, just that reminder that the value, the interest of each of these different elements is part of Pieixoto's focus, not just the story of Offred and what happens to us. And we aren't interested in what the titles of these cassette tapes are. Although the labels were authentic, they were not always appended to the tape with the corresponding songs. In addition, the tapes were arranged in no particular order, being loose at the bottom of the box, nor were they numbered. Thus, it was up to Professor Wade and myself to arrange the blocks of speech in the order in which they appeared to go. But, as I have said elsewhere, all such arrangements were based on some guesswork and are to be regarded as approximate, pending further research. And here we have this revelation that Offred's narrative that we have just read, this story of this handmaid, has been constructed and framed by Pieixoto and Professor Wade, that they have transcribed, written it up and put it together in the order. And just in terms of thinking about that framing of this narrative, it's really important to recognise then the similarities with how the narratives are constructed and framed in Frankenstein. Right, just a little bit more for this video, and then we'll read the next bit in a separate one. Once we had the transcription in hand, we had to go over it several times, owing to the difficulties posed by accent, obscure reference and archaisms. We had to make some decisions as to the nature of the material we had thus so laboriously acquired. So they've got these critical judgments, these decisions that are made about this person's story. Several possibilities confronted us. First, the tapes might be a forgery. As you know, there have been several instances of such forgeries for which publishers have paid large sums, wishing to trade, no doubt, on the sensationalism of such stories. And again, so another revelation about things that have remained unchanged in the post-Gilead is this kind of media-hungry sense for sensational stories. It appears that certain periods of history quickly become, both for other societies and for those that follow them, the stuff of not especially edifying legend, and the occasion for a good deal of hypocritic self-congratulation. And it's really interesting. So the stuff of legend rather than not based in reality, or the little tiny of kernels of reality that then create a whole idea. And then we have hypocritic self-congratulation. And what's really interesting is that we have this very hypocritical comment that is about to follow. If I may be permitted an editorial aside, allow me to say that in my opinion, we must be cautious about passing moral judgment upon the Gileadians. And so he goes on to say, surely we have learned by now that such judgments are of necessity culture specific. And Atwood, of course, along with us as the readers, sees this as being entirely wrong, that we see Gilead and we still experience it because of our lack of distance from Offred's story as a human tragedy. And we don't think that we should be giving particular cultures specific freedoms or allowances. We think that passing moral judgment on Gilead is absolutely correct, and this sense of academic distance is really problematic for us as readers with Offred's story so fresh in our minds. Also, Gileadian society was under a good deal of pressure, demographic and otherwise. Oh, so it's all completely fine. They had loads of reasons. They were under pressure, so we must understand, and were subject to factors from which we ourselves are happily more free. And so we can't possibly judge them because they have all these problems that we don't have. Our judge is not to censure, but to understand, and we have applause. And it's on this comment about not to censure, but to understand, where Atwood brings in her criticisms of liberal tolerance, the danger of extreme liberalism, and this is particularly, we suspect, in reference to the ideology seen in Calada, which is one of tolerance, one of appeasement, one of compromise, which places taking a moral stand or ethics to the side by comparison to working together. And so we see the danger of that. The danger of liberal tolerance is that you will accept and understand what happens somewhere else, because that's not what you even if it's not what you would do or what you would agree with, you aren't there, you're not culture specific, you don't understand what those people think or feel or do or believe, you don't understand their history. And that is the challenge, from one of the key challenges from the historical notes, that it is actually we do need to criticize from history. And if we look at the Hitler and Stalin, it's really easy for us to criticize those kind of totalitarian dictatorships, but neither of those two leaders, Hitler or Stalin, rose out of a vacuum of ideology, a vacuum of society or social change. And so we have to understand how they came into power so that we can ensure that we are keeping a real check and engagement with what's happening in our own societies and the societies around us. And that's why we're going to leave it for the beginning of the historical note.